Henry Cooper, a 78-year-old Vietnam War hero, boards a flight to return a fallen friend's medal, carrying a folded flag in quiet dignity. Mistakenly seated near first class, he's publicly rebuffed when asking for coffee instead of his economy meal. A young soldier, witnessing this, reveals Henry's heroic past, saving 17 lives under fire. The cabin's atmosphere shifts as shame replaces ignorance. Whispers of Henry's Silver Star and sacrifices spread, silencing the plane. What happens next? Will Henry's humility triumph over prejudice? And what secret connects him to the soldier? Stay tuned for the emotional resolution. Love stories of unsung heroes like Henry? Subscribe to my channel for more inspiring tales of courage and sacrifice. Your support helps share these powerful stories. Hit that subscribe button, join our community, and let's honor those who give everything without asking for anything in return. Henry Cooper, a 78-year-old former Navy sergeant, sat quietly in his economy class seat, his weathered hands resting on his knees. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as it cruised from Dallas to Washington, D.C., carrying him on a mission that weighed heavier than any physical burden. Tucked inside a worn canvas backpack on his lap was a triangular folded American flag, the kind handed to grieving families at military funerals, and a medal that once belonged to his closest friend, lost decades ago in the jungles of Vietnam. Henry's faded jacket hung loosely on his frame, and his Marine Corps cap, its emblem, slightly faded but proud, sat atop his silvered hair. His sharp eyes, undimmed by age, occasionally drifted to the window, but they didn't seem to focus on the clouds below. Instead, they traced memories of battles fought, promises kept, and a debt to a fallen comrade that had brought him on this journey. Henry had boarded the plane with no expectations, only a quiet determination to fulfill his purpose. When the ground staff had asked if he'd switch seats to accommodate another elderly passenger who needed easier aisle access, he hadn't hesitated. "Of course," he'd said, his voice steady and kind. "I can sit anywhere." The change placed him in a seat just shy of the first-class cabin, where the line between privilege and economy was marked only by a subtle shift in upholstery. He didn't mind. Comfort wasn't his priority. The flag and the medal in his bag were. Yet, as the plane reached cruising altitude, Henry felt the weight of his years, not in his body, but in the quiet isolation of being unseen, a man whose story no one bothered to ask. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with polished efficiency, their smiles warm for the first-class passengers, their interactions noticeably brisker with those in economy. Henry, ever polite, caught the eye of a young female attendant as she passed. His stomach, finicky with age, wasn't up for the standard economy sandwich. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle drawl of a man who'd lived a long life. "Could I possibly trade my meal for a cup of coffee and maybe a couple of cookies? It's easier on me these days." The attendant barely glanced at him, her eyes flicking to his boarding pass. Her response was clipped, delivered in a rehearsed tone that bordered on mechanical. "I'm sorry, sir. This section is reserved for first-class passengers only. Please return to your assigned seat in economy, where your meal service will be provided." Her voice carried just enough volume to turn heads nearby, and Henry felt a flush of quiet humiliation creep up his neck. He hadn't meant to cross any lines. He hadn't even realized he was seated so close to the invisible barrier between classes. Behind him, a young man in his 20s, dressed in a sharp blazer and holding a sleek phone, muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Still wearing that old hat like it's some kind of costume. Real heroes don't need to advertise." The words stung, sharp and careless, slicing into the quiet dignity Henry carried. He said nothing, his face a mask of composure, but his hands tightened around the edges of his cap as he gently removed it and placed it on his lap. His knuckles, marked with age spots and the faint scars of a life hard-lived, whitened as he gripped his backpack, the flag inside a silent testament to sacrifices no one around him could fathom. The weight of that flag and the memories it held pressed against his chest, heavier than any insult. He sat straighter, his posture unyielding, a habit forged through decades of discipline that time couldn't erode. Across the aisle, a woman in a tailored suit glanced at him, her eyes lingering for a moment before darting away, as if unwilling to confront the quiet injustice unfolding before her. Henry's thoughts drifted inward. He wasn't here for recognition, nor had he ever sought it. The cap wasn't a prop, it was a piece of who he was, a tether to the men he'd served with, the ones who hadn't come home. The medal in his bag wasn't his to keep. It belonged to a friend who'd thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad, a story Henry had carried in silence for over 50 years. This trip wasn't about glory or special treatment. It was about keeping a promise. Yet, in that moment, as the attendant's words echoed and the young man's jab lingered, Henry felt the familiar pang of being overlooked, reduced to an old man in a worn jacket, his worth measured by the price of his ticket. He wondered briefly if the world had always been this way, so quick to judge, so slow to see. The attendant's dismissal wasn't personal. He knew that. She was young, likely overworked, following rules she didn't make. But the sting of being unseen, of having his quiet request turned into a public reprimand, stirred something deep within him. Not anger, Henry had long since learned to let that go, but a quiet sorrow for a world that seemed to have forgotten how to pause, to listen, to honor what couldn't be measured in dollars or status. In the last row of the cabin, a young soldier in a simple military uniform watched the scene unfold. His paratrooper insignia gleamed faintly on his shoulder, and his posture carried the alertness of active duty. At 30, he was a stark contrast to Henry's weathered frame, but his eyes held a sharpness that missed nothing. He'd been quiet for most of the flight, his gaze occasionally scanning the cabin, but now it narrowed as he took in the exchange. The attendant's curt response, the young passenger's cruel remark, they didn't sit right with him. He felt a knot of frustration in his chest, a mix of respect for the older man's quiet dignity and anger at the casual disrespect tossed his way. He'd seen men like Henry before, veterans who carried their service not in boasts but in the lines on their faces, the weight in their eyes. To see one treated like this, dismissed and diminished, struck a chord. The soldier stood, his movements deliberate, and leaned toward a male flight attendant nearby. His voice was low, urgent, as he gestured toward Henry. Whatever he said caused the attendant's expression to shift. First surprise, then a flicker of understanding. The attendant hurried toward the service area, and a ripple of stillness spread through the cabin, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Henry, unaware of the exchange, kept his gaze on his lap, his hands still clutching the bag that held his friend's flag, his heart heavy with the past and the present colliding. In that moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unspoken to unfold. Henry didn't know it yet, but the soldier's quiet act of recognition was about to shift the course of his journey, a reminder that honor, even when unseen, has a way of finding its way back to those who carry it. The cabin of the airplane buzzed with the usual hum of travel, passengers settling in, overhead bins clicking shut, and the faint rustle of magazines being flipped through. But when the cabin crew members, in a quiet and almost choreographed motion, swapped their service assignments, an undercurrent of change rippled through the air. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the wind, but the atmosphere grew heavier, more deliberate. Conversations, once lively with complaints about legroom or the in-flight menu, softened to murmurs. Passengers exchanged glances, sensing something unspoken unfolding around them, though none could pinpoint exactly what it was. A few shifted in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the crise, while others simply felt the weight of the moment settle over them like a quiet fog. In the midst of this, a man in a rumpled jacket, who had earlier snapped a curt remark about the slow service, sat hunched over his phone. His fingers moved quickly, almost furtively, as he typed the name he had overheard from the young soldier seated a few rows ahead, Henry Cooper. The search results loaded in an instant, and what he read drained the color from his face. His eyes darted across the screen, absorbing the weight of the words. Henry Cooper, combat medic, Da Nang landing operation, 1968. Critically wounded while shielding 3 fellow soldiers from a barrage of artillery fire. Awarded the Silver Star for his valor. Further down, the screen revealed more. One of the last surviving members of Echo Company, credited with saving 17 lives during a brutal ambush that claimed 22 American soldiers. The man's breath caught in his throat. His earlier bravado, the sharp edge of his complaint, now felt like a stone in his stomach. He snapped his phone shut, sinking lower into his seat as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness of his own smallness in the presence of something far greater. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the young soldier, barely out of his 20s, his uniform crisp but his eyes carrying the weight of experience, moved with quiet purpose. He leaned in close to the lead flight attendant, his voice low, almost inaudible over the hum of the engines. Whatever he whispered carried a gravity that struck her like a lightning bolt. Her carefully maintained professional mask cracked, her eyes widening with a mix of recognition and reverence. A single tear escaped, quickly brushed away as she bowed her head, not out of obligation but out of instinct, as if standing before a monument. She turned swiftly, her movements deliberate, and headed to the galley to prepare a new meal tray. No announcement was made, no explanation offered, yet the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The usual clatter of service carts and the chatter of passengers faded into a profound silence, as if the plane itself understood it was carrying something sacred. The female attendant, who had earlier dismissed Henry's modest request, stood frozen for a moment, her hands hovering over a tray of plastic cups. Her mind raced, replaying the brief interaction, the way she'd brushed him off without a second thought. Now, knowing who he was, her chest tightened with regret. When she emerged from the galley, her demeanor had shifted entirely. Gone was the brisk efficiency of routine service. In its place was a quiet reverence, a softness in her step. She approached Henry, who sat unassisibly in his economy seat, his weathered hands resting on a worn cloth bag. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have a seat available in business class if you'd be more comfortable there." Her eyes, shimmering with respect, betrayed the training manual's polished courtesy. This was something deeper, something real. Henry, his face lined with the weight of decades, began to shake his head. Special treatment had never been his way. He'd spent his life deflecting attention, carrying the folded flag in his bag as a quiet reminder of a friend who never made it home. But before he could fully decline, the young soldier appeared at his side, his voice steady but gentle. "Sir," he said, "sometimes accepting honor isn't about you. It's about those who need to give it." The words landed like a key turning in a lock, unlocking something deep within Henry. His gaze softened, and after a long pause he nodded, gathering his belongings with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who carried more than just a bag. As he made his way toward the front of the plane, the cabin seemed to shift around him. Crew members stood a little straighter, their eyes following him with quiet respect. A few passengers, veterans themselves, sensed the unspoken significance of the moment, the way the air changes when someone who has seen the worst of humanity and risen above it is near. A young girl, no older than 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mommy, why's everyone so quiet?" Her mother leaned down, her voice soft but clear. "Sometimes, sweetheart, we're in the presence of greatness and don't even know it." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound, as Henry settled into the business class seat without fanfare. The cloth bag remained in his lap, its contents, a folded flag, never leaving his grip. It was more than a keepsake. It was a tether to a brother in arms, a promise kept across decades to bring him home. The lead flight attendant approached with a meal tray, her hands trembling slightly as she set it before him. Warm towels and a steaming cup of coffee followed, not because of any ticket status, but because of something far more valuable, respect that transcended protocol. She paused, her voice catching as she spoke. "My grandfather was in Vietnam too. Echo Company, 1967 to 1969. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with recognition. "What was his name?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. "Samuel Reeves," she replied. For the first time since boarding, a flicker of emotion crossed Henry's weathered face, like a crack in a dam holding back a lifetime of memories. "Sammy," he said softly. "I knew Sammy. He carried extra medical supplies for me after my kit was destroyed." The words hung between them, a fragile bridge spanning years and wars. Her voice trembled as she continued. "He had a photograph of you in his study until the day he died. He said you were the man who gave me my grandchildren. Henry's eyes glistened, but the tears didn't fall. Decades of discipline held them at bay. He was a good man, he said, brave when it counted most. Nearby an elderly passenger, his movements slow and deliberate, rose from his seat. He steadied himself on the armrest, his eyes fixed on Henry. With the care of someone whose body remembered the weight of time, he approached, his gaze heavy with understanding. He didn't speak, but the look they shared said enough. A silent acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, of battles fought and brothers lost. The moment passed quietly, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a steady drone that seemed to underscore the weight of unspoken stories. Sergeant Henry Cooper sat quietly in his seat, his weathered hands resting on a worn backpack, his eyes tracing the clouds beyond the window. The scars he carried were not visible to the casual observer, etched deep beneath the surface, in places no one could see unless they knew where to look. His face, lined with the passage of time, held a quiet strength, but there was a heaviness in his gaze, a silent archive of memories he rarely shared. A man approached, his steps hesitant, his voice barely rising above the engine's roar. "Sergeant Cooper," he said, the words trembling with a mix of awe and gratitude. Henry turned, his eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger's face. "I was on the medevac team after you held the line during that artillery strike. You saved my life." The man's voice cracked, and he extended a trembling hand. Henry clasped it with both of his, the gesture firm yet gentle, as if anchoring them both to this moment. "Williams?" Henry's voice was soft, but recognition sparked in his eyes, like a long dormant ember flaring to life. "Timothy Williams." The man nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No one thought you'd make it. 4 shrapnel wounds, and you still dragged Martinez to safety." The words hung in the air, raw and heavy, and without warning, the business class section erupted in applause. It wasn't the hollow kind, the sort meant for likes or shares on a screen. This was something deeper, a collective acknowledgement of a sacrifice that transcended time. The sound swelled, genuine and unprompted, as passengers turned to look at the unassuming man in the worn jacket, their faces reflecting a mix of reverence and shame. A young soldier in a crisp uniform stepped forward, his posture rigid with purpose. His voice cut through the cabin, clear and steady. This man was the last one at the door, holding it so we could get out. Today he asked for nothing more than a cup of coffee, and even that was too much for some. His words landed like a quiet rebuke, and several faces flushed with guilt, none more so than the flight attendant who had earlier dismissed Henry's request with a curt shake of her head. Her eyes dropped to the floor, her hands fidgeting as she grappled with the weight of her mistake. Another passenger, a man who had earlier mocked Henry's weathered appearance with a careless comment, leaned forward. His voice was low, almost breaking. "I didn't know, he whispered, his words thick with regret. "I'm sorry." Henry's response was a slight nod, his expression unchanging. He didn't need apologies. They were fleeting, weightless compared to the burdens he'd carried for decades. Instead, he reached into his backpack with deliberate care, withdrawing a neatly folded triangular flag. He placed it on his lap, his fingers tracing a creased edge with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and loss. "This belonged to Lieutenant James Harrison," he said softly to those seated nearby, his voice steady but laced with a quiet ache. "We were pinned down for 3 days. By the 3rd, shrapnel had taken his spine. He couldn't move his legs. When the extraction chopper came, he ordered me to leave him behind." Henry paused, his eyes distant, as if the memory had pulled him back to that smoke-filled battlefield. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the silence so profound it felt as though the plane itself had stilled. "Even after 50 years, he continued, his last words stay with me. Take my medal back to my family when this is all over. I've carried his silver star all this time, promising I'd return it to Arlington when my days grew short. I think that time's come." The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a sacred vow. Even those who hadn't heard the full story felt the gravity of the moment, an unspoken understanding that something profound was unfolding. A young girl seated a few rows away tugged at her mother's silk. "Who is he, Mommy?" she asked in a whisper that carried further than intended. Her mother, her throat tight with emotion, leaned down. A hero, sweetheart, the kind you'll never see on TV. The young soldier who had spoken earlier stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Henry. Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison, he introduced himself, his voice steady but reverent. Sir James Harrison was my grandfather. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes widening as disbelief and recognition collided. The soldier continued, "When I saw your name on the passenger manifest during pre-boarding, I knew I had to find you. My grandfather's letters mentioned you over and over. He wrote that if he didn't make it home, you were the one who'd keep your promise, no matter how many years passed." Henry's hands, rough and weathered, trembled slightly as they cradled the flag. The fabric seemed to hold not just the memory of his friend, but the weight of a half-century of duty. "I should have returned this sooner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with regret. Michael shook his head, his tone gentle but firm. "No, sir. You brought it back at exactly the right time. I'm escorting my mother, his daughter, to Arlington tomorrow. You've completed your mission perfectly, Sergeant." The cabin remained hushed, as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. When the plane touched down at Reagan National Airport, Henry didn't linger for special treatment or fanfare. He rose from his seat, his movements slow but deliberate, and placed his old Marine cap on his head with a practiced motion that spoke of decades of habit. The cloth bag holding the flag was tucked securely under his arm, never straying more than a few inches from his side, as if it were an extension of himself. Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison approached once more, his voice soft but resolute. "Sir, would you allow me to accompany you to the cemetery? My grandfather deserves to see that flag one more time." Henry studied the young man's face, and for a moment he saw James Harrison in the set of his jaw, the unyielding determination in his eyes. A flicker of memory stirred, nights under fire, shared laughter and fleeting moments of calm, and the final gut-wrenching order to leave a friend behind. "Your grandfather was one of the bravest men I ever served with," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "One of the best." No more words were needed. A single nod passed between them, carrying the weight of 50 years of loyalty and loss. As they stepped off the plane, the entire flight crew stood in a silent line at the exit, their faces a mix of respect and humility. Henry walked past them, his head held high, the flag secure in his grasp. For him, this was no moment of triumph, only the fulfillment of a promise kept. A quiet act that spoke louder than any applause. The air in the cabin was thick with the hum of the plane's engines. But for a moment, everything seemed to still as the captain emerged from the cockpit. His uniform was crisp, his face etched with a quiet respect that spoke of someone who'd heard countless stories but knew this one carried weight. He extended his hand toward Henry, an elderly man whose weathered fingers trembled slightly, not from age but from the flow of memories that came with such moments. "It's an honor to have you aboard, Sergeant Cooper," the captain said, his voice steady but warm, carrying the kind of sincerity that made Henry's chest tighten. Henry nodded, his jaw set, uncomfortable under the spotlight of admiration. He'd never sought it, never wanted it, but he understood its necessity, not for him, but for those who saw in him a living thread to a past they revered. His Marine cap, faded but proud, sat snug on his head, a silent testament to decades of duty. As they stepped into the bustling terminal, the chaos of travelers, rushing families, distracted businessmen, and weary tourists seemed to part around them. Henry walked beside a uniformed staff sergeant whose polished boots clicked against the tiled floor, a rhythm that stirred something in the air. At first it was subtle, a young airman pausing mid-stride, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the elderly man in the Marine cap. Then, like a ripple spreading across still water, others noticed. A Marine in dress blues straightened, his hands snapping to a salute. A naval officer followed, then an Army reservist. One by one, military personnel scattered throughout the terminal halted, their gestures unprompted, uncoordinated, yet unified by a shared recognition. No words were needed among them, but a naval officer nearby leaned toward a curious onlooker, his voice low and reverent. "That's a Sergeant Henry Cooper, Echo Company, Da Nang." The name alone was enough. For those who knew, it conjured images of jungles thick with danger, of brothers lost, of courage that didn't falter under fire. The onlookers' eyes widened and they fell silent, watching Henry pass with a respect they couldn't fully articulate. Henry's steps were measured, each one a quiet battle against the ache in his leg, a permanent reminder of shrapnel that had torn through muscle decades ago. He felt the weight of their gazes, not as judgment, but as a kind of shared burden, a mutual understanding that only those who'd served could grasp. His heart churned with a mix of pride and sorrow, the faces of fallen comrades flickering in his mind like old photographs. He didn't want their salutes, not really, but he accepted them because he knew they weren't just for him. They were for the men who never made it home, for the promises he'd carried in their stead. At baggage claim, I'd crowd thinned, but the air remained heavy with meaning. Henry's eyes locked onto a folded flag, carefully packed in a case among the suitcases and duffels. Staff offered to carry it, their voices gentle, almost pleading, but Henry shook his head, his grip firm as he lifted it himself. I made a promise, he said, his words soft but unyielding, like the man himself. The staff stepping back, respecting the resolve in his eyes. That flag wasn't just fabric. It was a vow, a piece of his soul tethered to a brother he'd lost 50 years ago. Carrying it was his duty, his penance, his privilege. His hands, though gnarled with age, held it with the same care he'd once used to cradle a wounded comrade, his heart pounding with the weight of memory. The next morning, as the first light of dawn spilled over Arlington National Cemetery, the world seemed to hold its breath. Henry stood before a headstone in Section 60, his back ramrod straight despite the years that had been his frame. The Marine cap still rested on his head, but his eyes were fixed on the engraved name before him, a name that had haunted his dreams for half a century. Staff Sergeant Harrison stood beside him, gloved hands steady, his young face a mask of solemnity that hid the awe he felt. Henry's movements were precise, deliberate, as he presented the flag in a ceremonial gesture that spoke of countless rehearsals in his mind. Each fold, each motion, was a tribute, a silent conversation between two men separated by time but bound by sacrifice. Harrison received the flag with equal care, his throat tight as he met Henry's gaze. No words passed between them. None were needed. The moment was theirs alone, unmarred by cameras or crowds, a sacred exchange that belonged to the quiet spaces of history. As they turned to leave, the soft crunch of gravel under their feet was the only sound in the stillness. Henry's limp was more pronounced now, the cold morning air seeping into his old wounds, but his face betrayed no pain. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd faced worse and emerged unbroken. Near the cemetery entrance, a small group of veterans had gathered, their presence unannounced but inevitable. Word had spread through the unspoken network that binds those who've served, a whisper of respect that drew them to this place. They stood in silence, heads bowed, their weathered faces etched with stories of their own. One veteran, his own service evident in the way he held himself, stepped forward when he noticed Henry's slight falter. He offered his arm, his gesture tentative but earnest. Henry paused, his eyes meeting the younger man's, and for a moment the ghost of a smile flickered across his face. Marines don't need help walking, he said, his voice gruff, but laced with warmth. The veteran nodded, a spark of understanding passing between them. No, sir, he replied, but friends walk together. In that moment, Henry felt the weight of his years lift, if only slightly. He thought of the men he'd served with, the ones who'd held their weapons not to kill but to protect, who'd returned home asking for nothing more than a nod of recognition, a seat among their fellow man. He thought of how the world had changed, how tickets and titles and price tags seemed to matter more than the quiet sacrifices that held no value in dollars. A cup of coffee might cost a few bucks, but the silence that fell over an entire plane when a captain spoke two words, "true hero," was priceless. In a world tethered by instant connections, Henry saw how easily people drifted from what truly mattered. The unspoken bonds forged in fire, the dignity of those who gave everything and expected nothing. As he walked on, the veterans falling in step behind him, Henry carried their respect not as a burden, but as a reminder. Their story wasn't just his, it was theirs too. And all those who'd served before and after, it was a story of promises kept, of wounds that never fully healed, of a quiet strength that endured. And in that moment, as the sun climbed higher over Arlington, Henry knew he'd given their story meaning, just as they had given it life.